In the dark corners of British history, evil has many faces. Some wore uniforms, some hid behind charm, and some rocked babies to sleep before taking their last breath. Today, we're uncovering the most notorious women who turned trust into terror. From mothers who betrayed their own children to killers who blended so seamlessly into society that no one saw them coming. As you watch, I want to know, which of these cases shocked you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice shapes the stories we tell next. And if you're ready for more deep dives into the darkest true crime cases, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's begin. Mary Ann Cotton, Britain's quietest killer. It was the morning of March 24, 1873, in Durham, England. A cold mist hung over the cobblestone streets, and outside Durham Gaol, a small crowd gathered. They stood silently, waiting for the bell that would signal the end of a life, the life of a woman accused of committing an almost unthinkable series of crimes. Inside the prison walls, Mary Ann Cotton, 39 years old, waited to be led to the gallows. For nearly 2 decades, she had lived as a wife, a mother, a nurse, and quietly, one of Britain's most prolific killers. Until her arrest, few had suspected her. Fewer still understood the scale of what she had done. Mary Ann didn't fit the image of a killer. To her neighbors, she was unremarkable. A seamstress with pale skin and dark hair, polite in her speech, modest in her habits. She could charm when she wanted to. She could play the part of a grieving widow or a loving mother with uncanny precision. Victorian England was a harsh place for working-class women. Men dominated property and income, and survival often meant depending on others. Mary Ann understood this world intimately. She grew up in a mining family, learned to sew, and married young. To outsiders, she was simply a woman trying to make her way through life's hardships. But beneath that image, something else was unfolding. A pattern that would leave at least 21 people unalived. Her victims were almost always those closest to her. Husbands, children, lovers, and even her own mother. The deaths seemed natural at first. Stomach pains, fever, vomiting. Victorian doctors, without modern testing, attributed these symptoms to common illnesses like typhoid or gastric fever. No one thought to question the tragedies that seemed to follow Mary Ann wherever she went. Her first husband, William Mowbray, died in 1865, along with 4 of their 5 children. Neighbors pitied her sorrow. She collected a small insurance payout and moved on. Her second husband, George Ward, grew mysteriously ill within a year of their marriage. He too died, leaving Mary Ann with another payout. Her third husband, James Robinson, narrowly survived her pattern. When 2 of his children died suddenly, he began to suspect something was wrong and forced her to leave. Even her own mother, living in County Durham, fell ill soon after Mary Ann came to visit. She died within weeks. By the early 1870s, she had lost 3 husbands, a lover, her mother, and 11 children. And yet, no one connected the dots. Her final chapter began when she married Frederick Cotton, a widower with 2 young sons. Within months, tragedy struck again. Frederick became sick and died. Then one of his boys, Charles Edward, fell ill and died too. Soon after, Mary Ann's infant daughter, also named Mary, met the same fate. But this time, there was a shift. The deaths were coming too quickly. Suspicion was starting to grow. It was a local parish official named Thomas Riley who first voiced concern. After Frederick's death, Mary Ann suggested sending the surviving stepson, also named Charles, to the workhouse. Riley hesitated. Why would a grieving mother want to discard her stepson so quickly? When Riley pressed her, Mary Ann allegedly said something chilling. "I won't be troubled long. He'll go the way of the others." Not long after, young Charles died, and this time Riley acted. He contacted the authorities. An autopsy revealed arsenic in the child's stomach. As investigators dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Exhumed bodies of Mary Ann's past victims revealed the same thing: arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was easy to obtain at the time, sold as a household product for cleaning and pest control. Most people used it safely. Mary Ann used it to erase anyone who stood between her and what she wanted. Her motive wasn't just money. though life insurance policies, a new phenomenon in Victorian England, played a significant role. The payouts were small, but for someone living in poverty, they meant freedom. Psychologists today might call it instrumental killing, removing obstacles, creating opportunities, shaping life on her own terms. Mary Ann seemed to view people as temporary fixtures in her story, valuable only as long as they served her needs. Mary Ann's trial in 1873 became a national sensation. For many Victorians, the idea that a woman, especially a mother, could commit such crimes was almost impossible to accept. Women were seen as natural nurturers, moral anchors of the family. Mary Ann shattered that illusion. In court, she maintained her composure. She denied everything. She claimed the deaths were illnesses, blamed poor sanitary conditions, and even suggested that household arsenic might have accidentally contaminated food. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses recalled her suspicious comments. Chemists confirmed the presence of poison. Insurance records revealed a disturbing consistency. Each death coincided with a payout. After a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty. On the morning of March 24, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was led to the gallows at Durham Jail. Public hangings were still common, and dozens of people watched as she took her final steps. But the execution was poorly handled. The drop was too short. Instead of a quick death, she struggled for several minutes as the rope slowly tightened. For the crowd, it was a grim and ironic ending for a woman who had inflicted so many drawn-out deaths herself. Mary Ann Cotton is often remembered by numbers. 21 victims, 16 of them children. But her story is more than a body count. She exposed vulnerabilities in Victorian society, a world where death was common, medical science was limited, and women could move through communities with little scrutiny. Her crimes forced changes, too. The investigation into her killings helped push for better death certification practices and greater regulation of poisons like arsenic. In an indirect way, her actions contributed to reforms that would make it harder for others to follow in her footsteps. Even today, her name lingers in folklore. Children in northern England once sang a rhyme, "Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten, lying in bed with her eyes wide open." It's a haunting reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, not in the shadows, but in the person pouring your tea, tucking you into bed, or wiping your fevered brow. Mary Ann Cotton didn't just unalive her victims, she dismantled the very idea of safety in the home. And in doing so, she became the figure that Britain still calls its first female serial killer. Amelia Dyer, the woman who sold death. On March 30, 1896, a package floated silently down the River Thames in Reading, England. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied neatly with string, the kind of parcel you might expect to contain old clothes or household items. But when it was pulled ashore and opened, the truth inside was horrific. The body of an infant, strangled with white tape. The tape was tied in a deliberate bow, a signature of sorts. This discovery was the beginning of the end for Amelia Dyer, a woman whose name would become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in British crime history. To the outside world, Amelia Dyer was a respectable matron. Born in 1837 to a middle-class family in Bristol, she trained briefly as a nurse, then presented herself as a caregiver for children at a time when such services were desperately needed. In Victorian England, poverty and shame often left unmarried mothers with few choices. Workhouses were harsh, and raising a child alone could mean social ruin. Baby farming, paying someone to care for an unwanted infant, was a grim but common practice. Amelia seemed like an answer to their prayers, a God-fearing woman offering a safe home for their babies. She advertised in newspapers with phrases like, "Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home." She promised compassion. What she delivered was death. The infants she took in came from all over England. They were entrusted to her by desperate mothers, laundresses, domestic servants, women who could not afford to keep their children but wanted them to survive. Many handed over small payments, believing their babies were going to better lives. Some even wrote letters begging for updates, never knowing their children had already been unalived. The scale of her crimes is staggering. Over a career spanning 3 decades, she is believed to have killed between 400 and 600 infants, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. In her early years, Amelia allowed some of the babies to die slowly from deliberate neglect, starvation, untreated illness. Authorities grew suspicious when so many infants in her care died of natural causes, so she adapted her methods. She realized that strangulation left fewer questions. She began using white edging tape, the kind found in sewing kits, to end the lives of the children quickly and quietly. The tape became her signature. She later told police, "You could tell it was one of mine by the tape around the neck." Amelia moved frequently to avoid detection. When neighbors became curious about the number of small coffins leaving her lodgings, she would pack up and vanish, setting up her adoption business in another town. She often used false names in her advertisements, reinventing herself each time. Despite brief encounters with the law, including a stint in a mental institution, likely feigned to escape scrutiny, she always returned to baby farming, and with each move, the number of victims grew. By the mid-1890s, Amelia had grown careless. She began disposing of bodies in rivers rather than burying them, perhaps believing the water would erase her crimes. But that March morning in 1896 changed everything. The parcel found in the Thames wasn't just a body, it was evidence. The wrapping paper carried a name and an address. Police traced it back to Amelia Dyer. When officers raided her house, they were met with a scene that chilled even hardened detectives. The smell of decomposition lingered in the air. Baby clothes were scattered everywhere. Adoption paperwork, telegrams from mothers, and rolls of the same white tape used to strangle her victims were found throughout the house. Money was the surface motive. Each infant brought in a small payment, enough to keep her work profitable. But there was something deeper at play. Amelia's letters to mothers revealed no guilt, only efficiency. She rarely bothered to create elaborate lies about where the children had gone. Once she received the fee, their lives seemed to lose all value in her mind. Some historians have suggested she may have grown to resent the babies, seeing them as symbols of a society that marginalized women like herself. Others point to her time in mental institutions, where she may have learned how to manipulate perceptions of her sanity. Whatever the reason, she operated with chilling detachment, a businesswoman of death. Amelia Dyer's trial was swift. Police linked her to at least 6 bodies, though everyone understood the true number was far higher. Witnesses included mothers who had entrusted her with their children, describing how she appeared kind and trustworthy. Medical experts testified about the method of strangulation and the consistency of her crimes. In court, Amelia showed little emotion. She pleaded guilty to a single murder, perhaps hoping to limit the evidence presented against her. The jury took only 4 minutes to convict her. On June 10, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison in London. When asked if she had any final words, she simply said, "I have nothing to say." Her death brought an end to her personal reign of terror, but it did not erase the trauma she left behind. Hundreds of mothers never learned what became of their babies. Many went to their own graves believing they had given their children a chance at life. Amelia's crimes forced Britain to confront uncomfortable truths. Her case led to stricter adoption and fostering laws, making it harder for unregulated baby farming to continue. Yet her story remains a symbol of how desperation was, and exploitation can intertwine, creating conditions where human life becomes transactional. What makes her legacy so haunting is not just the scale of her crimes, but the way she turned care itself into a weapon. She didn't lure her victims through force or threats. She was trusted. She was chosen. She held the very thing those mothers longed for, the promise of safety, and she destroyed it. Even now, more than a century later, her name carries a chill. Amelia Dyer wasn't a shadowy figure hiding from society. She was a product of it, and that might be the most unsettling part of all. Myra Hindley, the face of the moors. On October 10, 1965, police in Manchester unearthed a shallow grave on Saddleworth Moor. The body inside belonged to Leslie Ann Downey, a 10-year-old girl who had vanished months earlier. The desolate landscape, stretching cold and silent under a gray sky, had hidden more than just one secret. Within weeks, investigators realized the moors were a graveyard, and at the center of the horror were two names that would haunt Britain for decades: Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Before her name became synonymous with evil, Myra Hindley appeared ordinary. Born in 1942, she grew up in Gorton, Manchester. Her childhood wasn't easy. Her father drank heavily, her mother struggled to cope, but nothing in those early years hinted at the darkness to come. By her late teens, she worked as a typist, rode motorcycles, and bleached her hair to a striking platinum blonde. Friends described her as confident, even caring. She was devoted to her grandmother, enjoyed dancing, and seemed like any other young woman finding her place in the world. It wasn't until she met Ian Brady in 1961 that her path shifted. She was 18, he was 23. Brady was intense, charismatic, and obsessed with violence and control. For Hindley, his approval became everything. Within 2 years, she wasn't just following him. She was participating. The pair's victims were children, each one lured with promises of safety, only to encounter unimaginable cruelty. Pauline Reed, 16, vanished in July 1963 while on her way to a dance. John Kilbride, 12, was taken after being offered a ride home from a market. Keith Bennett, 12, disappeared on his way to visit his grandmother. His body has never been found. Leslie Ann Downey, 10, was abducted from a fairground on Boxing Day in 1964. Edward Evans, 17, was killed in October 1965, an act that would finally expose them. What drove Myra Hindley? Some argued she was manipulated by Brady, a woman who fell under the spell of a sadistic man. Her defenders claimed she was weak, vulnerable, and desperate for love. But the evidence told a more complex story. Hindley wasn't just obeying Brady. She enabled him. She used her role as a woman to gain the trust of children, something Brady couldn't have done alone. Psychologists described her as someone who had fused her identity with Brady's ideology. She read the same books he did, including Mein Kampf and writings on cruelty and power. Over time, she seemed to lose the ability, or perhaps the will, to distinguish between his fantasies and her own choices. Even decades later, when she began seeking parole, her explanations of her actions often sounded less like remorse and more like rationalization. For many, that ambiguity made her more unsettling than Brady himself. In 1966, Hindley and Brady were tried at Chester Assizes. The courtroom heard details that shocked the nation: the tape, the photographs, the calculated way each child was lured and killed. Hindley, dressed in prim clothing with her hair neatly styled, sat quietly through most of the proceedings, occasionally glancing at Brady. Her demeanor, cold, detached, only deepened public revulsion. She was convicted of 2 murders and 1 count of being an accessory to another. Because the death penalty had been abolished just months earlier, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Brady would later be declared criminally insane and moved to a psychiatric hospital. Hindley, however, remained in prison, becoming the most reviled female inmate in British history. Myra Hindley died in 2002 after nearly 40 years behind bars. By then, she had spent years campaigning for parole, claiming she had changed, that she was no longer the woman who had committed those crimes. But public opinion knows. Ever softened. For many in Britain, her name wasn't just associated with murder, it was synonymous with betrayal. Perhaps that's what made her crime so haunting. She didn't look like danger. She looked like someone you might trust to help you find your way home, someone a child might follow without hesitation. Her actions revealed a truth that people found hard to face, that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in the person who seems safe. And on Saddleworth Moor, where the wind still cuts across the heather and the earth still holds its secrets, the memory of those children lingers, a quiet reminder of how far deception can reach when someone chooses to embrace it fully. Rose West, the quiet terror behind closed doors. On February 24, 1994, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England. To outsiders, it was an ordinary terraced house, faded brick, a sagging front gate, nothing remarkable about it. But beneath its floors and in the garden outside, investigators uncovered a secret that would horrify the nation. The remains of multiple young women, their lives taken over a span of nearly 2 decades. Among those arrested was Rosemary West, a mother of 8, who had spent years presenting herself as a homemaker. Her husband, Fred West, would later confess to the killings. But it was Rose's role, equal, active, and chillingly deliberate, that made her one of the most infamous female killers in British history. To neighbors, Rose seemed, at least on the surface, like an ordinary woman. Born in 1953 to a troubled family, she grew up poor and largely unnoticed. As a teenager, she was shy, heavy-set, and awkward, traits that made her appear unthreatening. By 16, she had met Fred West, a man 12 years older with a history of violence and controlling behavior. Their relationship was intense and volatile, but to the outside world, Rose played the part of a devoted partner. She kept house, raised children, and even took in lodgers to make ends meet. People who visited Cromwell Street described her as chatty, sometimes even friendly. There was nothing about her demeanor that hinted at what was happening behind closed doors. The victims were often young women who believed they were entering a place of safety. Lodgers, runaways, girls seeking work. Some were members of Rose's own family. Charmaine West, Rose's 8-year-old stepdaughter, disappeared in 1971 while Fred was in prison. Investigators later concluded Rose had taken her life alone. Heather West, Rose's 16-year-old daughter, was killed in 1987 after years of abuse wit. Rose's motives were complex, rooted in both her past and her choices. Psychologists later described her as exhibiting traits of sadistic personality disorder, deriving satisfaction from domination and suffering. Unlike Fred, who often portrayed himself as driven by compulsions he couldn't control, Rose seemed purposeful. She wasn't merely participating, she was shaping events. Her early life had been marked by instability and abuse, factors often cited to explain her capacity for violence. But many who studied her case pointed out that countless others with similar backgrounds never commit such acts. For Rose, violence wasn't just a reaction to her circumstances. Over time, it became part of her identity. Fred West died by suicide in prison before standing trial, leaving Rose to face the charges alone. In 1995, her trial began at Winchester Crown Court. The evidence was overwhelming: forensic findings, survivor testimony, and Fred's own statements implicating her as an equal partner. Witnesses described how Rose could switch from charming to terrifying in an instant, a duality that allowed her to maintain control both inside and outside the home. After a 7-week trial, Rose was convicted of 10 counts of murder and sentenced to a whole-life tariff, ensuring she would never be released. As the verdict was read, she showed little emotion, a calm that unsettled even seasoned court observers. Today, 25 Cromwell Street no longer exists. The house was demolished in 1996, the ground leveled to erase the physical reminder of what happened there. But erasing the building did nothing to erase the memory of the lives lost or the unsettling questions Rose West's crimes left behind. How does someone who appears ordinary cultivate such darkness? How can cruelty take root so deeply that it becomes indistinguishable from daily life? Rose West's story is not just about the violence she inflicted, but about the trust she betrayed. Victims entered her home believing they were safe. Some were her own children, others strangers seeking kindness. She turned that trust into a weapon, using the role of a caregiver to mask acts of destruction. Her whole life sentence ensures she will die in prison. But the shadow of her actions lingers. Each victim's name, Charmaine, Heather, and the others, whose lives ended in that house, stands as a reminder that evil often hides in the places we least expect. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: behind the walls of 25 Cromwell Street, terror wasn't loud or chaotic. It was quiet. It was deliberate. And it lived in the hands of a woman who looked, to the outside world, like anyone else. Joanna Deni, a killing spree without a cause. On March 30, 2013, police in Peterborough, Cambridgeshire, responded to a call about a body found in a drainage ditch on the outskirts of town. The victim was a man in his 30s, his body marked by multiple stab wounds. At first, detectives believed it was an isolated act of violence. But over the next 10 days, 2 more men were discovered, one dumped in a separate ditch nearby, another hidden just a few miles away. All three victims were stabbed in eerily similar ways. And in each case, there were no signs of robbery, no apparent motive, and no obvious connection between the men who had been targeted. The randomness of the crimes unsettled investigators. It wasn't just the brutality of the killings that stood out. It was the absence of reason. The person responsible turned out to be someone most people wouldn't have suspected. Joanna Deni, a 30-year-old woman with striking green eyes and a quick, disarming smile. To acquaintances, she appeared unpredictable but charismatic. Born in 1982, Deni grew up in a stable, middle-class family in Hertfordshire. She had been bright in school, even described as ambitious. But her teenage years brought sudden changes. She began drinking heavily, using drugs, and drifting away from her family. By her 20s, Deni was known more for her volatility than her potential. She moved frequently, formed short-lived relationships, and had 2 children she eventually abandoned. Yet those who met her often found her magnetic, even likable, at least at first. She didn't fit the stereotype of someone capable of calculated violence. That disconnect between appearance and reality made what followed even harder to comprehend. Unlike many killers, Deni's victims weren't chosen because of personal grudges or financial gain. They were men who trusted her. Lucas Slaboszewski, 3. 1. Had met Deni only a few days before his death. He was reportedly infatuated with her, believing she was interested in him. She lured him to a house with the promise of a meeting, then stabbed him through the heart. Kevin Lee, 48, was Deni's landlord and, by some accounts, romantically involved with her. He had helped her find accommodation and work. She killed him on March 29th, dressing his body in a black sequin dress before leaving him in a ditch. John Chapman, 56, was a housemate at the same property. He was attacked and killed in similar fashion, stabbed multiple times. After disposing of the bodies with the help of 2 male accomplices, Deni wasn't finished. Days later, she traveled to Hereford, where she stabbed 2 more men, strangers, leaving them critically injured but alive. When asked why she spared those final victims, she later said she was bored of killing. The spree was brief but devastating, unfolding over less than 2 weeks. After each killing, Deni seemed energized rather than shaken. She laughed, joked, and even sent taunting messages. In one, she wrote to her accomplice, "I'm going to go on a killing spree. I want to have my fun." Surveillance footage later showed her casually strolling through shops, smiling and joking, even as police across the region searched for her. It was as though the crimes had given her a sense of control she hadn't found anywhere else in her life. When investigators pieced together her movements, they realized she had chosen her victims not because of who they were, but because of what they represented: opportunities. Each man was vulnerable, alone with her, and unlikely to resist her approach. On April 4, 2013, Deni was arrested in Hereford. Even in custody, her demeanor remained chillingly casual. She flirted with officers, joked about her crimes, and seemed almost proud of what she had done. When asked why she killed, she gave no coherent motive. There was no financial gain, no revenge, no ideological justification. Instead, she described the killings as fun, saying she wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. Psychiatrists later concluded she had a severe personality disorder with psychopathic traits, an absence of empathy paired with a need for stimulation and dominance. Her accomplices, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton, were later convicted for their roles in helping dispose of the bodies, but it was clear Deni was the driving force behind the crimes. Understanding Deni's actions requires looking beyond traditional motives. Experts who assessed her described a rare type of offender, someone who kills purely for the experience, not out of necessity or compulsion. She didn't fit the profile of a serial killer driven by compulsion or trauma. Her killings were spontaneous, yet deliberate, impulsive, yet calculated. One psychiatrist noted that she seemed to enjoy the power the killings gave her, the ability to decide who lived and who died. Another observed that her behavior after the murders suggested she wanted recognition, even infamy. She had reportedly drawn inspiration from violent fictional characters, telling acquaintances she wanted to be like Bonnie and Clyde, though she clearly had no interest in sharing control with anyone. In November 2013, Joanna Deni pleaded guilty to 3 murders and 2 attempted murders. Her plea surprised many. By admitting her crimes, she bypassed the spectacle of a full trial. In February 2014, she was given a whole life order, making her only the 3rd woman in the UK at the time to receive such a sentence, alongside Myra Hindley and Rose West. The judge described her as a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative killer, emphasizing that her actions were not just inhumane, but entirely devoid of reason. Even during sentencing, Deni showed no remorse. She smiled, shrugged, and joked with guards, as though the entire process were a performance staged for her amusement. Joanna Deni's crimes stand out not only for their brutality, but for their lack of a clear motive. Most killers, however twisted, can be traced back to something: revenge, money, ideology, compulsion. Deni seemed to act simply because she wanted to, because it gave her a feeling she couldn't find anywhere else. That absence of reason makes her story uniquely unsettling. She wasn't hiding behind a mask of normalcy like Rose West, nor was she driven by someone else's influence like Myra Hindley. She created her own narrative, one where human life had no value except as a source of entertainment. Her whole life sentence ensures she will never leave prison, but the unease she created lingers. Her case forces a question few want to ask. What do you do with someone who kills not because they have to, but because they choose to? Simply to feel alive. Louise Porton, a mother without mercy. On January 15, 2018, emergency services were called to a hotel in Rugby, Warwickshire. 21-year-old Louise Porton stood calmly beside a paramedic, holding her phone, as her 3-year-old daughter, Lexi Draper, was pronounced dead. The cause of death was unclear. Doctors initially believed it might have been a sudden illness. Louise cried quietly as she told friends and family she had lost her little girl unexpectedly. Her social media posts were filled with tributes, painting a picture of a grieving mother. But just 18 days later, on February 1st, tragedy struck again. Louise's second daughter, Scarlett Vaughn, only 17 months old, also died suddenly. This time, investigators began to look closer. 2 children, gone within weeks of each other, both previously healthy. The odds of coincidence were almost impossible. Louise Porton had crafted an image many found convincing. Outwardly, she was a young mother trying to balance the challenges of raising 2 children alone. Friends described her as attractive, confident, and always active on social media. Behind the curated selfies and light-hearted posts, she lived a transient life, moving between temporary accommodations, taking modeling gigs, and spending long hours messaging men online. To those who didn't know her well, Louise appeared independent, someone determined to live her life despite the responsibilities of motherhood. But those closest to her noticed cracks in that facade. She often complained about her children. Caring for them, she said, was holding her back. Lexi and Scarlett were not just Louise's daughters. They were her entire world in the eyes of others. 2 bright, healthy little girls who adored their mother. Lexi, the elder, was described as lively and affectionate, while Scarlett, still a baby, was beginning to show her own personality. To everyone around them, the girls were inseparable. They trusted their mother completely, never knowing the person they depended on most was beginning to see them as obstacles. In the weeks leading up to Lexi's death, those around Louise began to notice strange behavior. She frequently left the girls with relatives, often making excuses about work or personal plans. On January 14th, the day before Lexi died, Louise made 2 emergency calls in the middle of the night, claiming her daughter was struggling to breathe. Paramedics attended, but found nothing seriously wrong. Hours later, she called again, this time reporting that Lexi was unresponsive. Louise rode in the ambulance as paramedics tried to save her daughter. Witnesses later recalled her demeanor was subdued but not distraught. Doctors could not determine the exact cause of death, but accepted Louise's account of Lexi having fallen ill suddenly. With condolences pouring in, Louise posted a message online. Life will never be the same without you. Yet behind the scenes, she was already speaking to new men on dating apps. After Lexi's death, friends assumed Louise would cling tightly to Scarlett, her only surviving child. Instead, her focus appeared to shift further away from parenting. Phone records showed she spent hours messaging men, arranging dates, and taking suggestive photos. On January 31st, she called her sister to say Scarlett seemed unwell. But instead of seeking immediate help, Louise drove to a retail park to run errands, leaving Scarlett alone in the car for an extended period. That evening, she checked into a hotel. By the next morning, Scarlett was dead. This time, medical staff were alarmed. Scarlett, like Lexi, had been healthy with no underlying conditions. 2 unexplained deaths in such a short span raised suspicions, and a police investigation was launched. Detectives began piecing together Louise's movements in the weeks leading to the deaths. Surveillance footage revealed she had been calm and deliberate, even moments after calling emergency services. Her phone told an even darker story. In the hours after Lexi's death, she had searched for modeling opportunities and exchanged flirtatious messages with multiple men. After Scarlett's death, she sent suggestive photos to a contact just hours before police questioned her. Perhaps most chillingly, internet searches on her device included queries about how long it took for a child to suffocate and whether drowning left visible signs. Post-mortem examinations concluded both girls had likely died from deliberate airway obstruction, consistent with strangulation or smothering. Faced with mounting evidence, Louise denied harming her children, insisting they had died of natural causes. But her explanations didn't align with the forensic findings or her own digital trail. Why would a mother take the lives of her own children? Psychologists who studied the case suggested Louise exhibited narcissistic and histrionic traits, focused on her own desires and unable to see her children as individuals with needs of their own. For Louise, Lexi and Scarlett had become symbols of restriction. Friends recalled her frequently saying she needed to be free and that having children so young had ruined her life. This wasn't a crime of sudden rage or desperation. It was calculated. In her mind, removing the girls was a way to reclaim control, to return to the life she believed she deserved. In August 2019, Louise Porton stood trial at Birmingham Crown Court, charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecution presented a timeline of her actions, emphasizing the cold contrast between her daughter's suffering and her pursuit of attention from men. Jurors saw the messages she sent after Lexi's death, messages arranging to meet someone new. They heard from experts who concluded the deaths could not have been accidental. Louise showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. When the verdict was read, she remained still as the jury found her guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years, calling her actions calculated and deliberate, and describing her as someone who had prioritized her own lifestyle over the lives of her children. The story of Louise Porton is difficult to comprehend because it shatters one of society's deepest assumptions, that a mother's instinct is to protect her children at all costs. Lexi and Scarlett were too young to understand the danger they faced. To the very end, they trusted their mother, believed she loved them, believed she would keep them safe. That betrayal is what makes this case so haunting. Louise Porton's name is now etched into British criminal history as a symbol of selfishness taken to its most devastating extreme. But it's not her story that matters most. It's theirs. 2 little girls whose lives were cut short before they had the chance to begin. And perhaps the most sobering thought is this. The warning signs were subtle, hidden behind smiles, filtered photos, and the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the very person a child trusts most. Beverly Allett, the Angel of Death. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spring of 1991. At Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, a small pediatric ward in Lincolnshire, England, doctors and nurses were accustomed to treating sick children. Some days were tragic, but most ended with hope. Then, over the course of just 59 days, the ward became a place of confusion and fear. Babies and toddlers who were expected to recover suddenly collapsed without warning. Some never woke up. It wasn't until the fourth child had died and 9 others had narrowly survived that staff began to confront an unsettling question. Was someone inside the hospital deliberately harming the very children they were meant to protect? At the center of it all was Beverly Allett, a 22-year-old nurse. To those who knew her casually, she didn't seem dangerous. She was quiet, even shy. She wore the crisp white uniform of a caregiver and spoke softly to parents, assuring them their children were in good hands. Allett had grown up in a working-class family in the nearby village of Corby Glen. As a teenager, she struggled to fit in, often skipping school and seeking attention in unusual ways. She suffered frequent, unexplained illnesses and spent long stretches in hospitals. Yet by the time she qualified as a state-enrolled nurse, she had crafted a convincing image, a young woman dedicated to helping children. To the parents on the ward, she was simply Nurse Beverly. Someone who smiled kindly, someone they could trust. The children who came under her care were some of the most vulnerable. Premature babies, toddlers with mild infections, infants recovering from routine procedures. Their parents believed they were in a safe place. 7-week-old Liam Taylor was admitted with a chest infection. His prognosis was excellent. Within hours of being left alone with Allett, he suffered an unexpected cardiac arrest and died. 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, who had epilepsy but was otherwise stable, collapsed shortly after Allett was assigned to his care. He, too, died suddenly. Katie Phillips, a premature infant, suffered repeated, near-fatal episodes of collapse. After being discharged, her parents, still unaware of the danger, brought her twin sister Becky to the ward for observation. Becky died the same night, while Katie survived but was left permanently brain damaged. In total, 4 children were unalived and 9 more were injured, all within a span of less than 2 months. Each incident occurred during Allett's shifts, yet the pattern went unnoticed at first. The methods were subtle but devastating. Allett injected insulin to induce sudden drops in blood sugar and air into veins to cause fatal embolisms. Because many of her victims were already fragile, their collapses initially seemed like tragic medical complications. She often volunteered to stay late or take extra shifts, positioning herself near the sickest children. After each collapse, she appeared calm, even helpful, assisting in the resuscitation attempts she herself had made necessary. To her colleagues, it looked like dedication under pressure. To investigators later, it looked like performance. By April 1991, whispers began to spread among staff. The number of unexplained deaths was rising. Doctors ordered tests on surviving children and discovered dangerously high insulin levels in their blood, levels that could only be caused by deliberate overdose. Suspicion turned toward the nursing staff, and gradually the focus narrowed to one name. When detectives began their inquiry, they discovered a chilling timeline. Every suspicious incident occurred during Allett's shifts, and often after she had been alone with the child. Her personnel records revealed a history of erratic behavior and unexplained absences. Police searched her home and found syringes and hospital equipment she had taken without authorization. Confronted with the evidence, Allett offered no explanation. She neither confessed nor convincingly denied her involvement, maintaining a detached demeanor that baffled investigators. Forensic testing confirmed the use of insulin and air injections. By the time the case went to trial, prosecutors believed they were dealing not with a series of tragic mistakes, but with deliberate, calculated acts. Why would a nurse, someone entrusted with saving lives, harm children? Psychiatrists concluded that Allett exhibited symptoms of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition in which a caregiver creates or exaggerates illness in others to gain attention and sympathy. In her case, the drive seemed extreme. She not only induced illness, but pushed it to its fatal conclusion. Throughout her adolescence, Allett had sought medical attention for herself, often with fabricated or exaggerated symptoms. In hospitals, she received care, concern, and validation she didn't find elsewhere. As a nurse, she seemed to replicate that dynamic on others, creating crises so she could appear as the heroic caregiver. But her actions went beyond seeking attention. her victims were defenseless. The deliberate use of insulin and air showed planning, control, and a chilling absence of empathy. In 1993, Beverly Allett stood trial for 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 6 counts of grievous bodily harm. The courtroom heard harrowing testimony from doctors, forensic experts, and grieving parents. The prosecution described her as manipulative and dangerous, someone who had betrayed the deepest trust imaginable. The defense argued diminished responsibility due to her mental condition. The jury found her guilty on all counts. Rather than being sent to prison, she was detained indefinitely at Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility where she remains to this day. The story of Beverly Allett is not just about the children she harmed, though their names and faces remain the heart of it. It's also about trust, how it can be both essential and fragile. Parents handed their babies to a nurse, believing they were safe. Colleagues worked beside her, unaware that their dedication to healing was being exploited. Her crimes forced hospitals across the UK to re-evaluate safeguards, leading to tighter controls on medication and more robust monitoring of staff. Yet the unsettling truth remains. Systems are built on trust, and when someone chooses to weaponize that trust, the damage can be profound. Allett's name endures as a warning, not because she was the first to betray such trust, but because she did so in the place most people consider untouchable, a children's ward. And in the quiet reflection after her trial, one question lingers. How do you protect innocence when the danger wears the uniform of care? Mary Piery, the lover who killed twice. On the evening of October 24th, 1890, in the quiet suburbs of Kentish Town, London, a man walking home stumbled upon a strange sight, a pram abandoned in the middle of the road. Inside was the lifeless body of a baby girl, just 18 months old. Hours later, only a few streets away, another discovery was made. The body of a woman, her throat cut, her face barely recognizable. The victims were quickly identified: Phoebe Hogg and her infant daughter Tiggy. Londoners were stunned by the brutality of the crime. At a time when the city was still reeling from the terror of the Whitechapel murders only 2 years earlier, the question arose almost immediately: who could have committed such an act, and why? The answer, investigators soon discovered, was someone hiding in plain sight: Mary Piery, a 24-year-old woman with a reputation for being both lively and unpredictable. Mary had come from a modest background. By all appearances, she was an ordinary young woman living alone and working intermittently as a domestic helper. Those who knew her described her as sociable, even charming, but also impulsive, with a tendency toward jealousy when it came to relationships. To the outside world, Mary seemed like many other women of her class, navigating life in London with limited means and limited options. But beneath that facade was a possessiveness so intense it would destroy an entire family. The crime was not random. Phoebe Hogg was the wife of Frank Hogg, a furniture remover who had been romantically involved with Mary Piery for several years. Mary and Frank's relationship was complicated. She was passionately attached to him, while Frank, though affectionate, never fully committed. When Phoebe became pregnant and married Frank, Mary's position shifted from lover to outsider. Still, Frank maintained contact with her, and Mary made to tolerate his double life, at least outwardly. But resentment simmered. Neighbors later recalled moments where Mary spoke bitterly about Phoebe, though she never openly threatened her. That bitterness, however, would soon manifest into violence. On the afternoon of October 24th, Mary invited Phoebe and Tiggy to her home on Priory Street. Historical records suggest Phoebe accepted the invitation without suspicion, perhaps believing Mary wanted to reconcile or simply spend time with the child she reportedly adored. What happened next can only be pieced together from forensic evidence and Mary's own shifting statements. Investigators believe Mary attacked Phoebe suddenly, using a blunt instrument to incapacitate her before slashing her throat. Tiggy, likely witnessing the assault, was then smothered. Mary's next actions were methodical. She placed Tiggy in her pram and carried Phoebe's body through the streets under the cover of dusk, eventually dumping them separately to mislead investigators into thinking the murders were unrelated or the work of a deranged stranger. She returned home, cleaned as best she could, and later went about her evening as though nothing had happened. At first, police considered the possibility of a random attack, but within days, suspicion turned to Mary Piercy. Witnesses reported seeing her pushing a pram matching Tiggy's earlier that evening. Detectives who visited her home noticed bloodstains on the walls, ceiling, and even the door handle. When asked to explain them, Mary claimed she had been killing mice. Forensic testing in 1890 was rudimentary, but even then, investigators could distinguish human blood from animal blood. The stains were human. Confronted with this evidence, Mary remained calm, even cooperative, but her explanations grew increasingly inconsistent. She neither confessed nor convincingly denied the crimes, behaving as though she were detached from the reality of what had happened. Why did Mary Piercy kill Phoebe and Tiggy? Prosecutors argued it was jealousy, a classic woman-scorned narrative. She wanted Frank to herself, and in eliminating Phoebe and her child, she believed she could reclaim him. But psychological assessments, primitive as they were at the time, suggested something more complex. Mary displayed traits of emotional volatility and obsession, yet also chilling rationality in how she executed the crime. Her decision to invite Phoebe over, to kill both mother and child, and to stage the bodies all pointed to premeditation rather than a moment of passion. Some speculated she harbored deeper resentments, not just toward Phoebe, but toward the societal constraints that left her dependent on men like Frank for status and security. In Mary's mind, the murders may have felt like a way to assert control, though in doing so, she destroyed any chance of the life she imagined. Mary Piercy's trial began in December 1890 and drew immense public attention. Newspapers compared her to the shadow of Jack the Ripper, even speculating whether she could have been connected to those infernal Amos killings, though no evidence ever supported the theory. Throughout the proceedings, Mary remained composed. She listened to testimony about the blood in her home, the eyewitness accounts, and the forensic evidence without visible emotion. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, she neither wept nor protested. On December 23, 1890, she was executed by hanging at Newgate Prison. Her final words were recorded simply as, "My sentence is a just one." One detail often overlooked is the chilling precision with which Mary managed her relationships even after the murders. Letters discovered in her home revealed she had been corresponding with multiple men, not just Frank, suggesting she may not have been as singularly devoted to him as people assumed. Another curious fact, after her death, Mary's brain was reportedly preserved for scientific study, part of a 19th century effort to understand criminal pathology. Researchers found nothing unusual, a finding that disturbed those hoping science could explain her violence. Mary Piercy's case endures because it challenges simple explanations. Was she driven purely by jealousy, or was she acting out something darker, rooted in obsession and control? Phoebe Hogg and her daughter Tiggy were not symbols in a tragic story. They were victims, a young mother and her child, whose trust in someone they knew was betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. And perhaps that is what makes Mary Piercy's story so unsettling, her ability to mask her intentions behind the ordinary face of friendship. In life, she seemed unremarkable. In death, she became a reminder that violence can emerge not from the shadows, but from familiar hands. When we look at these cases together, a chilling pattern emerges. None of these women looked like monsters from the outside. They were mothers, lovers, nurses, neighbors, people you might have passed on the street without a second thought. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a smile. Each story forces us to ask hard questions about motive, about control, and about what drives someone to cross the line from ordinary life into unthinkable violence. Were they born this way, or were they shaped by the worlds they lived in? What do you think? Which case struck you the most, and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and your perspectives help keep these discussions going. And if you found this deep dive valuable, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story we uncover together.